Cities did not fall to the Mongols in slow collapse. They vanished. Walls, populations, memory, removed with a precision that felt deliberate, almost systematic. What remained was not conquest alone, but absence. At the opening of the 13th century, the political landscape of Inner Asia was not empty, but fractured into competing tribal confederations. Alliances shifted constantly, and survival depended on loyalty that could disappear overnight. Into this environment emerged Genghis Khan, a leader shaped by early instability, exile, and calculated adaptation. His rise was not built on sudden dominance, but on a gradual restructuring of power among the steppe tribes. The unification he achieved was neither simple nor inevitable. Rival clans were defeated, absorbed, or eliminated, and traditional hierarchies were replaced with a system that prioritized merit and obedience. Loyalty shifted from bloodline to command. This transformation created a force that could act with cohesion across vast distances, something earlier steppe coalitions had failed to sustain. Mobility alone does not explain Mongol success. Their cavalry was highly disciplined, but many nomadic groups possessed similar advantages. What distinguished the Mongols was their integration of intelligence, planning, and psychological pressure into a single system. Information gathering preceded movement. Scouts mapped terrain, merchants carried rumors, and defectors provided insight into enemy defenses. Warfare began long before armies appeared at city walls. Early campaigns against the Tangut state of Western Xia revealed a willingness to adapt. The Mongols encountered fortified settlements that could not be overcome by mobility alone. Instead of retreating, they learned. Engineers were captured and compelled to build siege equipment. Techniques were studied and refined. This pattern of absorbing useful knowledge from conquered populations became central to their expansion. Conflict with the Jin dynasty marked a further escalation. Northern China presented fortified cities, dense populations, and organized resistance. The Mongols responded not by avoiding these challenges, but by expanding their capabilities. Siege warfare became systematic. Supply lines were maintained. Armies coordinated movements across multiple fronts. The scale of warfare increased, but so did the precision. Yet beyond tactics and logistics, a more unsettling pattern emerged. Resistance was not treated as a temporary obstacle. It was transformed into a warning. Cities that resisted Mongol demands were often subjected to extreme destruction. This was not random violence, but a deliberate strategy. Submission typically led to incorporation into the empire, with taxation and relative stability. Resistance, however, could result in mass killing and devastation designed to send a clear message to others. The psychological dimension of this approach spread rapidly. Trade routes carried stories of destroyed cities. Envoys reported on the consequences of defiance. Whether numbers were exaggerated mattered less than the consistency of the reports. The message became clear across regions. Resistance could lead to total annihilation. This strategy became fully visible during the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. The conflict began with a breakdown in diplomatic relations after a trade caravan was seized and its members executed. The response was not limited retaliation. It became a coordinated invasion aimed at dismantling the empire entirely. Cities across Central Asia were fortified and accustomed to conflict, but their defenses were built for conventional warfare. The Mongols disrupted these expectations. Armies advanced rapidly, often dividing into separate columns that moved independently before converging. Communication between cities was cut off. Reinforcements were intercepted before they could organize. At Bokhara, the consequences of resistance became unmistakable. After breaching the city, Mongol forces carried out extensive killing and destruction. However, the process was not entirely indiscriminate. Skilled workers were often spared and reassigned within the empire. This selective survival reveals a calculated balance between destruction and utility. The fall of Samarkand reinforced this pattern. Despite strong defenses, internal divisions weakened resistance. Some factions surrendered, others resisted. The Mongols exploited this lack of unity, isolating defenders and accelerating collapse. Once the city fell, mass killing and enslavement followed, alongside the redistribution of skilled individuals. These events established a consistent model. Each destroyed city reinforced the credibility of Mongol threats. Each city that surrendered and survived reinforced the alternative. Over time, this created a shift in how resistance was evaluated. The cost of defiance became increasingly clear. Discipline and organization supported this system. The Mongol military was structured into units based on a decimal system, allowing for efficient command and control. Orders could be transmitted quickly, and units could operate independently while remaining coordinated. This flexibility allowed Mongol armies to adapt to changing conditions without losing cohesion. Communication networks extended this advantage. Relay stations enabled rapid transmission of information across long distances. Armies could coordinate movements with precision that many opponents could not match. This logistical efficiency allowed the Mongols to overwhelm forces that were often larger but less organized. The incorporation of diverse populations further strengthened their capabilities. Conquered peoples contributed skills in engineering, administration, and warfare. This integration created a system that valued function over origin. Opponents often faced a force that included elements of their own traditions, repurposed against them. As expansion continued, destruction and control developed alongside each other. Regions that submitted were integrated into administrative systems that facilitated trade and governance. The same structures that enabled conquest were used to maintain stability across vast territories. However, the memory of destruction persisted. Stories of annihilated cities influenced decisions far beyond the immediate battlefield. Leaders faced a choice that extended beyond military calculation. Resistance was no longer just a strategic option. It became a risk with potentially irreversible consequences. By the time Mongol forces moved further west, their reputation had already shaped the outcome of many encounters. In some cases, cities surrendered without direct conflict. The expectation of destruction altered behavior before armies even arrived. This shift marked a deeper transformation in warfare. Conflict extended beyond physical battles into perception and fear. The Mongols refined this approach into a system that reshaped how conquest operated across regions. For each new city, the question was no longer only whether it could defend its walls. It was whether those walls, and everything behind them, could survive the cost of resisting. The Mongol advance into Western territories did not begin with chaos. It began with calculation. Routes were studied, distances measured, and weaknesses identified long before the first units crossed into new lands. By the time their armies appeared, the outcome had often already been shaped. Following the collapse of the Khwarezmian Empire's central authority, Mongol forces did not pause to consolidate in the traditional sense. Instead, they extended outward in deliberate directions, probing regions that had limited exposure to steppe warfare on this scale. Fragmented governance across these lands created conditions that favored Mongol methods. Local rulers often acted independently, and communication between cities lacked consistency, slowing coordinated defense. A defining feature of Mongol operations during this phase was division of forces. Armies separated into multiple coordinated units, each assigned specific objectives. This allowed rapid territorial coverage while preserving the ability to concentrate strength when required. For defenders, this created uncertainty. It became difficult to determine where the primary threat lay or when dispersed forces might suddenly reunite. As Mongol columns entered Persia and the Caucasus, they adapted to unfamiliar geography without abandoning core principles. Mountain terrain limited large-scale cavalry movement, while fortified settlements required careful siege preparation. Yet mobility remained central. Rather than forcing direct confrontation in unfavorable terrain, Mongol commanders prioritized maneuver, seeking routes that preserve their advantages. At Nishapur, resistance resulted in extensive destruction after the city's fall. Contemporary sources describe large-scale killing, though exact figures remain uncertain. What is consistent across accounts is the severity of the outcome. The destruction reinforced Mongol reputation across surrounding regions, strengthening the psychological dimension of their campaigns. This pattern was not arbitrary. It operated within a structured framework. Cities that resisted faced severe consequences, while those that submitted early were often spared widespread devastation. In such cases, Mongol administration was introduced, taxes were imposed, and local elites sometimes retained limited authority under supervision. This dual approach created a clear, if harsh, set of choices for those in the path of expansion. In the Caucasus, Mongol forces encountered resistance shaped by geography and local experience. Armenian and Georgian were familiar with defensive warfare in mountainous regions. Instead of committing to prolonged direct assaults, Mongol units conducted reconnaissance, identifying accessible routes and weaker. Engagements were selective, designed to apply pressure without overextending. This method extended to their interactions with regional coalitions. Mongol forces often initiated contact through probing attacks, withdrawing when resistance stiffened and returning with adjusted tactics. Over time, this eroded defensive cohesion. Opponents were forced into reactive positions, unable to predict the timing or scale of subsequent assaults. Further north, the open steppe once again favored traditional Mongol strengths. Here they encountered the decentralized political structure of the Kievan Rus. Authority was divided among multiple princes, each controlling separate. Coordination between them was limited, and rivalries weakened collective response. The Battle of the Kalkar River in 1223 illustrated Mongol tactical precision. Operating under generals rather than the direct presence of Genghis Khan, Mongol forces engaged a coalition of Rus and Kuman armies. They employed a feigned retreat, drawing opposing forces into extended pursuit. As the coalition advanced, its formation stretched and cohesion diminished. When the Mongols reversed direction, they were decisive. The pursuing forces, now disorganized, were unable to regroup effectively. The engagement resulted in heavy losses for the coalition and demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol tactics in unfamiliar environments. Despite this success, the Mongols did not immediately occupy Rus territories. Instead, they withdrew eastward. This decision reflects a broader strategic approach. The campaign functioned as reconnaissance and demonstration rather than permanent conquest. Information gathered during these encounters would inform future operations. In Central and Western Asia, Mongol forces continued consolidating control over previously captured regions. Cities that had submitted were integrated into administrative systems designed to facilitate governance and resource extraction. Trade routes were secured and communication networks expanded, linking distant into a more unified structure. This integration altered regional dynamics. Movement became more predictable, and merchants could travel under Mongol protection with increased security. Information flowed more efficiently, contributing to both economic activity and administrative oversight. While initial conquest brought destruction, subsequent governance emphasized stability within controlled. However, this stability was conditional. Rebellion after submission could provoke responses similar to those faced by cities that had resisted initially. This reinforced the importance of compliance and discouraged attempts to reverse Mongol authority once established. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare continued to evolve. Fear was no longer based solely on distant reports. It was reinforced by visible, consistent outcomes. Communities understood that Mongol responses followed a pattern. The consequences of resistance or submission could be anticipated, even if the severity remained daunting. Military organization supported these strategies. The decimal system allowed flexible scaling of operations, enabling commanders to control units of varying sizes with efficiency. Autonomy at lower levels combined with adherence to broader objectives created a balance that preserved both initiative and coordination. Communication networks extended beyond military use. Relay systems facilitated rapid transmission of orders, information, and resources across vast distances. This infrastructure reduced the effective isolation of distant regions, allowing the empire to function with greater cohesion. The incorporation of skilled individuals from conquered territories further strengthened Mongol capacity. Engineers improved siege capabilities, administrators refined governance, and artisans contributed to economic production. This integration reinforced a system that valued practical function over origin. As Mongol influence expanded, neighboring regions adjusted their strategies. Some pursued diplomatic engagement, others strengthened defenses, and many reconsidered the cost of resistance. The presence of Mongol forces reshaped decision-making processes far beyond the immediate of conflict. By the mid-1220s, Mongol campaigns had demonstrated consistent effectiveness across varied environments. From fortified cities to open pay, their methods adapted without losing coherence. The combination of mobility, coordination, and psychological pressure created a model of warfare that challenged existing defensive systems. Yet expansion required continuous reassessment. Distance, terrain, and logistical demands imposed limits that could not be ignored. Mongol commanders addressed these constraints through planning and adaptation, maintaining flexibility while preserving core operational principles. As their reach extended further, the implications became increasingly clear. Resistance was no longer a temporary act of defiance. It was a decision with consequences that could outlast the city itself. The next phase of Mongol expansion did not rely on new ideas. It relied on repetition. The same methods, applied with consistency, began to produce larger consequences. What had destroyed cities would now begin to reshape entire regions. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the empire did not fragment as many steppe confederations had before it. Instead, the structures he established held. Authority transferred to his successors, and the system continued to function with discipline. This continuity was critical. It allowed expansion to proceed without interruption, preserving momentum that might otherwise have been lost in succession. Under the of his sons and generals, Mongol campaigns resumed with a renewed focus on both consolidation and further conquest. Regions that had been destabilized but not fully controlled were brought into the imperial system. At the same time, new targets were identified, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where political fragmentation created familiar vulnerabilities. The Western campaign, often associated with Bada Khan and the general Subutai, demonstrated how earlier was refined into large-scale coordinated. Unlike earlier raids, this was a sustained, involving multiple armies advancing across vast distances with synchronized timing. The invasion of the Rus principalities began in the late 1230s. Once again, decentralization played a decisive role. Individual cities attempted to defend themselves, but lacked unified command. Mongol forces exploited this fragmentation, targeting cities sequentially while preventing effective coordination between defenders. At Ryazan, resistance was met with destruction. Contemporary chronicles describe the city being overwhelmed after a brief siege, followed by killing of inhabitants. While medieval sources often amplify numbers, the consistency of accounts to severe devastation. The fall of Ryazan established the pattern that would repeat across the region. The Mongols did not linger. Speed remained essential. After each assault, forces regrouped and advanced, maintaining pressure that prevented neighboring cities from organizing collective resistance. This tempo was as important as battlefield success. It ensured that fear spread faster than coordinated. At Vladimir, one of the political centers of the Rus, the same methods were applied. Siege engines, constructed or transported with the army, breached defenses. The city fell, and destruction followed. Leadership structures were dismantled, further weakening the possibility of organized resistance across the region. The campaign continued toward Kiev, a city of symbolic and significance. By the time Mongol forces approached in 1240, their reputation had already shaped expectations. Some attempted negotiation, others prepared for defense, but the overarching pattern remained unchanged. The siege of Kiev demonstrated the full of Mongol siege capability. Engineers deployed battering rams, siege towers, and possibly early forms of gunpowder weapons acquired through previous conquests. After breaching the walls, Mongol forces entered the city, and large-scale killing followed. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests extensive destruction, though precise figures remain debated. The fall of Kiev marked more than a military victory. It represented the level of political and cultural authority in Eastern Europe. The consequences extended beyond immediate loss of life. Trade networks were disrupted, structures collapsed, and regional power dynamics shifted. Following this, Mongol forces pushed further into Central Europe. In 1241, they confronted armies in Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Legnica and the Battle of Mohi, Mongol tactics once again demonstrated their effectiveness. Feigned retreats, coordinated and disciplined formations allowed them to defeat larger forces that lacked comparable cohesion. European armies, structured around heavily armored knights and feudal levies, struggled to respond to the inflexibility of Mongol units. Communication during battle was limited, and coordination between different contingents often broke down. The Mongols exploited these weaknesses, isolating segments of opposing armies and them in detail. Despite these victories, the Mongol advance into Central Europe did not continue indefinitely. The death of the Great Khan Ogdi in 1241 prompted a withdrawal of key commanders, including Batakhan. This decision reflects the importance of centralized authority within the Mongol system. Strategic priorities shift rapidly in response to internal political developments. While Mongol forces withdrew from parts of Europe, the impact of their invasion remained profound. Entire regions have been devastated, populations reduced, and political structures destabilized. The psychological was equally significant. European states became acutely aware of a that operated beyond their traditional frameworks. In parallel, Mongol campaigns continued in the Middle East under different commanders. The methods refined in Central Asia and Eastern Europe were applied again, but adapted to new contexts. Cities with strong fortifications and established administrative systems required careful planning. Yet the underlying principles remain consistent. What becomes clear during this phase is the scalability of Mongol strategy. Techniques that had been effective against individual cities were applied across entire regions without losing effectiveness. This was made possible by disciplined organization, reliable communication, and a structure that allowed coordination across vast distances. Psychological warfare continued to function as a force multiplier. Reports of destroyed cities in one region influenced decisions in another. The Mongol reputation was no longer localized. It had become trans-regional, shaping behavior across continents. Yet, alongside destruction, systems of governance expanded. Taxation, census-taking, and administrative oversight were implemented in controlled territories. The Mongols did not seek continuous devastation. They sought control that could sustain the empire over time. This duality, destruction and integration, defined Mongol expansion at its height. Resistance triggered annihilation. Submission enabled incorporation. The clarity of this system reduced uncertainty, even as it increased the stakes of decision-making for those in its path. As the 13th century progressed, the Mongol Empire reached up unmatched in previous history. It had demonstrated the ability to operate across diverse environments, from the forests of Eastern Europe to the deserts of the Middle East. And within each new region, the same question continued to emerge. Not whether the Mongols would arrive, but whether anything would remain if resistance followed. The expansion into the Middle East did not represent a change in Mongol intent. It represented a deeper test of their system against older, more entrenched civilizations. What had worked on the steppe and in fragmented states would now confront established empires. By the mid-13th century, Mongol turned its focus toward the Islamic world's political centers. This phase of expansion was led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, tasked with extending Mongol authority into Persia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Unlike earlier campaigns driven primarily by rapid movement, this advance required sustained logistical planning and coordination over long distances. The regions targeted were not politically unified, but they possessed deeply rooted administrative systems and fortified urban centers. Among them, the Abbasid Caliphate stood as both and symbolic authority. Its Baghdad was one of the most significant cities of the medieval world, known for its scholarship, trade, and governance. Before direct confrontation, the Mongols employed familiar methods. Envoys were sent, demands issued, and the option of submission presented. This was consistent with their broader strategy. Compliance would lead to incorporation. Refusal would invite consequences already demonstrated across in Europe. The Abbasid leadership did not fully align its response with the scale of the threat. Internal political limitations, combined with underestimation of Mongol capabilities, resulted in inadequate preparation. Defensive measures were not coordinated at a level necessary to withstand a prolonged siege. When Mongol forces approached Baghdad in 1258, they did so with a combination of military and expertise. Siege engines, including trebuchets, were deployed with precision. Surrounding areas were secured to prevent reinforcement or escape. The city, once a center of intellectual and cultural activity, became isolated within its own defenses. The siege itself was methodical. Walls were targeted, supply lines severed, and pressure applied continuously. Mongol forces did not rely on a single decisive assault. Instead, they combined sustained bombardment with strategic positioning, gradually weakening. Within a relatively short period, breaches were created, and entry into the city became possible. The aftermath of Baghdad's fall was severe. Contemporary accounts describe large-scale killing and destruction, though exact figures remain debated among historians. What is clear is that the city's infrastructure, population, and institutions suffered catastrophic damage. Libraries, administrative centers, and areas were affected, marking a profound in the region's cultural and political landscape. That of Baghdad carried significance beyond immediate military victory. It represented the effective end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a central political force. The symbolic authority that had persisted for centuries was dismantled, altering the balance of power across the Islamic world. Yet even in this, Mongol actions reflected a combination of destruction and calculated utility. Skilled individuals were identified and spared where possible. Administrators, artisans, and engineers were incorporated into the expanding Mongol system. This pattern, seen in earlier campaigns, continued to define their approach. Following Baghdad, Mongol forces moved towards Syria, encountering the Mamluk Sultanate. Unlike many previous opponents, the Mamluks possessed a highly organized military structure and in cavalry warfare. This created a different challenge, one that could not be addressed solely through established Mongol methods. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, Mongol forces faced a disciplined opponent capable of countering their tactics. The Mamluks, familiar with pay warfare through their own backgrounds, anticipated Mongol strategies such as feigned retreat. When these tactics were employed, they were met with controlled responses rather than disorganized pursuit. The battle resulted in a significant Mongol defeat. It demonstrated that Mongol superiority was not absolute. Under certain conditions, particularly against opponents who understood and could adapt to their methods, there could be effectively challenged. This marked in Mongol expansion. While they remained dominant across much of Eurasia, their into the deeper regions of the Middle East was limited. The Ain Jalut showed that the system, while highly effective, had constraints. Despite this, Mongol governance in Persia and surrounding regions continued to develop. The Ilkhanate, established under Hulagu Khan, became of administration and economic activity. Trade routes were maintained, and connections between East and West were strengthened under Mongol oversight. The integration of these regions into a broader imperial framework facilitated movement of goods, ideas, and people across unprecedented distances. This period, sometimes associated with increased connectivity, reflected the dual nature of Mongol expansion. Initial conquest brought destruction, but subsequent governance enabled stability within controlled territories. However, this stability was always contingent on compliance. Rebellion or resistance could still provoke severe responses. The memory of earlier destructions, including, remained a powerful deterrent. It influenced decisions not only within Mongol, but also in neighboring states observing their methods. Military organization continued to support imperial control. The same structures that enabled rapid conquest were adapted for governance. Communication networks ensured that directives could be transmitted efficiently. Local administrators operated under overarching Mongol authority, maintaining order while facilitating resource extraction. The psychological dimension of Mongol power persisted. It was reinforced not only by past destruction, but by ongoing demonstration of capability. Even where Mongol armies were not present, their influence shaped behavior through reputation alone. As the empire reached its extent, its impact on global dynamics became increasingly evident. Political boundaries shifted, trade networks realigned, and established powers adapted to a new reality defined by Mongol presence. The campaigns in the Middle East highlighted both the and limitations of Mongol strategy. They showed that while destruction could enforce submission, it could also provoke resistance from capable of adaptation. And in that tension between dominance and resistance, a new phase of Mongol history began to take shape. A phase where control would depend not only on conquest, but on the ability to maintain authority over what had already been taken. The Mongol Empire did not reach its height through conquest alone. It endured because it learned how to hold what it had destroyed. Control, not expansion, became the next test of its power. By the mid-13th century, Mongol rule stretched across an unprecedented span of territory, linking East Asia to Eastern Europe and the Middle East. This vast domain could not be sustained through continuous campaigns alone. It required systems capable of managing populations, resources, and communication across immense distances. The same discipline that had defined Mongol warfare was now applied to governance. Under successors of Genghis Khan, the empire was gradually divided into administrative regions, often referred to as khanates. These included the Golden Horde in the western steppes, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan. While each region developed its own, they remained connected through shared political and military traditions. Governance required adaptation. Nomadic methods, effective on the steppe, were insufficient for densely populated agricultural regions. Mongol rulers incorporated existing administrative systems rather than replacing them entirely. In China, they relied on established bureaucratic practices. In Persia, they utilized local administrators familiar with taxation and record-keeping. This pragmatic approach allowed continuity while ensuring Mongol authority remained dominant. Taxation became a central of control. Populations were assessed, resources counted, and obligations defined. This process was not always uniform, and in some regions it imposed burdens. However, it also created predictability. Subjects understood what was required of them, reducing uncertainty compared to the arbitrary demands that often conquest. Trade networks experienced significant transformation under Mongol rule. The stabilization of vast territories enabled the expansion of routes connecting east and west. Merchants could travel with relative safety, protected by imperial authority. This system, often associated with the concept of the Pax Mongolica, facilitated the movement of goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals across continents. Communication infrastructure supported this integration. Relay stations, known as YAM systems, were established at regular intervals. These stations allowed messengers to travel rapidly, carrying information, orders, and intelligence. The speed of communication reduced the effective distance between regions, enabling coordinated administration on a previously unattainable. Yet the stability of Mongol was never entirely secure. It depended on continued compliance from subject populations. Resistance, whether in the form of rebellion or refusal to meet obligations, could still provoke severe responses. The memory of earlier destructions remained a tool of enforcement, even as the empire shifted toward governance. In some regions, Mongol rulers adopted elements of local culture to their legitimacy. Kublai Khan, for example, embraced aspects of Chinese political tradition, presenting himself not only as a conqueror but as a legitimate emperor within the existing framework. This approach facilitated acceptance among segments of the population, though it also created tension within Mongol elites who valued steppe traditions. Religious tolerance was another characteristic of Mongol rule. Unlike many contemporary states, the Mongols generally allowed the practice of multiple religions within their territories. Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, and other communities coexisted under imperial oversight. This policy was not purely ideological. It served practical purposes by reducing conflict and enabling cooperation across diverse populations. Despite these integrative strategies, challenges persisted. The vast scale of the empire made unified control difficult. Distances remained significant, and local conditions varied widely. Over time, regional differences became more pronounced, leading to increasing autonomy among the Khanates. While they shared a common origin, their political priorities began to diverge. Economic pressures also influenced stability. Maintaining large forces and systems required substantial resources. In some areas, taxation became excessive, leading to unrest. Environmental factors, including droughts and resource depletion, further strained local economies, complicating governance. The legacy of destruction continued to shape interactions between rulers and subjects. In regions that had experienced severe devastation, populations were reduced and recovery was slow. Urban centers that had once been vibrant required decades to rebuild. This affected not only local economies, but also the broader of trade and production. At the same time, the Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented levels of connectivity. Knowledge, technologies, and influences moved across regions with greater. Innovations in one part of the empire could, to others, contributing to a dynamic exchange that reshaped societies. Military organization remained an element of imperial. Even as the focus shifted toward governance, the Mongols maintained their ability to respond rapidly to threats. Garrisons were positioned strategically, and mobile forces could be deployed when necessary. This ensured that the threat of force remained credible. However, the nature of that force was changing. Large-scale, while still possible, became less frequent in regions that had been integrated. The emphasis shifted toward maintaining order rather than enforcing submission through destruction. This transition reflects the broader evolution of Mongol rule from expansion to administration. By the late 13th century, the empire faced a complex balance. It had achieved territorial dominance on a scale unmatched in history, yet sustaining that dominance required continuous adaptation. Internal divisions, economic pressures, and local all posed challenges that could not be addressed through military means alone. The transformation from conquering force to governing authority revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Mongol system. Its flexibility allowed it to incorporate diverse regions and peoples. It's ensured that control could be maintained across vast distances. But its reliance on centralized authority and continuous resource extraction created vulnerabilities that would become more apparent over time. What had begun as a campaign of had evolved into an empire of. The same mechanisms that once erased cities were now used to sustain them under new authority. Yet of those erased cities remained. It lingered in the policies of rulers, the fears of populations, and the calculations of those who lived under Mongol rule. Because even in stability, the possibility of destruction was never entirely removed. Power at this scale does not collapse suddenly. It fractures slowly along the same that once held it together. The Mongol Empire did not fall in a single moment. It began to separate from within. By the late 13th century, the unity that had defined Mongol expansion was under increasing strain. The empire, once directed through authority rooted in the of Genghis Khan, had expanded beyond the limits of direct. What had been a system of coordinated campaigns began to transform into a network of semi-independent states, each adapting to its own regional realities. The division into khanates, initially an administrative necessity, gradually became a political reality. The Golden Horde in the western steppes, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China no longer operated with alignment. While they shared lineage and historical identity, their priorities diverged based on geography, economy, and local challenges. Communication, once a defining strength, became more complicated over distance. The Yam relay system continued to function, but the sheer scale of the empire meant that decisions made in one region were not always synchronized with developments in another. Delays, misunderstandings, and competing interests began to weaken centralized coordination. One of the most significant sources of tension was succession. The Mongol political system did not follow a strict hereditary line in the manner of many settled empires. It was often determined through councils, negotiations, and, at times, conflict among elite members. This created periods of instability whenever a great Khan died, as factions competed for influence. After the reign of Kublai Khan, the cohesion of the empire declined further. His rule had represented to integrate Mongol authority with established Chinese governance structures. While this approach brought stability within the Yuan dynasty, it also distanced the eastern regions of the empire from the steppe traditions that had originally unified Mongol leadership. In Persia, the Ilkhanate underwent its own transformation. Over time, Mongol rulers in this region converted to Islam, aligning themselves more closely with the religious framework of their subjects. This shift facilitated governance, but also marked a departure from the broader Mongol identity that had once connected the Khanates. The Golden Horde followed a similar path, developing its own political and economic systems centered on control of trade routes across the Eurasian Pay. Its rulers interacted extensively with Russian principalities, extracting tribute while allowing a degree of local autonomy. This arrangement created a different relationship compared to direct administrative control in other regions. As each Khanate adapted, the shared identity of the Mongol Empire became less cohesive. Alliances between regions weakened, and in some cases, conflicts emerged. Formerly unified forces now faced each other as rivals, reflecting the fragmentation of authority. Economic pressures also contributed to this process. Maintaining large territories required sustained resource extraction. In regions where populations had been significantly reduced due to earlier conquests, economic recovery was uneven. Agricultural took time to stabilize, and trade networks, while extensive, were vulnerable to disruption. Environmental factors further complicated governance. Climatic fluctuations, including periods of drought, affected pasture lands and agricultural zones. These conditions strained local economies and, by extension, the of Mongol rulers to maintain stable taxation systems. Military organization, once a source of strength, began to shift in response to these changes. While the core principles of discipline and mobility remained, regional forces adapted to local conditions. In China, armies incorporated more infantry and naval elements. In Persia, forces reflected a blend of steppe and Middle Eastern traditions. This diversification, while practical, reduced the uniformity that had characterized earlier Mongol campaigns. The psychological impact of Mongol dominance also evolved. In earlier phases, fear of destruction had been a primary in securing submission. Over time, as Mongol rule became established, this fear was replaced in some regions by routine governance. populations adjusted to new systems, and the immediate memory of conquest began to fade. However, this did not eliminate resistance. Rebellions occurred in various parts of the empire, often driven by economic hardship, local grievances, or challenges to legitimacy. Suppressing these uprisings required resources and coordination, further testing of regional authorities. In the Yuan dynasty, internal unrest became increasingly significant. Administrative challenges, combined with economic strain and social tensions, weakened central control. Efforts to maintain authority required balancing Mongol interests with the needs of a large and diverse population. Meanwhile, in the Ilkhanate, political instability emerged following the of key rulers. Succession disputes and shifting alliances created periods of uncertainty. Although the region retained as a center of trade and governance, its connection to the broader Mongol world diminished. The Golden Horde maintained relative stability for a longer period, benefiting from its control over trade routes and tribute systems. However, it too faced internal divisions and external pressures, particularly from emerging in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. What becomes evident in this phase is that the very mechanisms that enabled rapid expansion also contributed to fragmentation. The emphasis on flexibility and regional adaptation allowed the empire to grow, but it also made long-term unity difficult to sustain. The absence of a central authority capable of enforcing consistent policy across all regions meant that divergence was inevitable. Each khanate evolved according to its circumstances, gradually becoming distinct entities rather than components of a single empire. Despite this fragmentation, the legacy of Mongol expansion remained significant. Trade networks continued to connect distant regions. Cultural and technological exchanges persisted. The political map of Eurasia had been permanently altered, even as the empire itself became divided. The memory of Mongol methods, both destructive and administrative, continued to influence neighboring states. Military strategies adapted in response to their tactics. Political systems incorporated lessons learned from there. In this, the Mongol Empire was no longer a singular, moving outward. It was a collection of, each carrying forward elements of a past while pursuing its own future. And in that gradual separation, the nature of Mongol power changed, no longer defined solely by conquest, but by the complex process of maintaining over what had already been taken, even as unity slipped beyond reach. What remains after an empire fractures is not silence. It is memory carried forward through systems, fears, and adaptations. The Mongols did not disappear. Their methods endured. By the 14th century, the unified structure of Mongol power had largely dissolved, but it's continued across Eurasia. The khanates that emerged from the original empire no longer operated as a single coordinated force, yet they retained elements of Mongol military organization, administrative practice, and strategic thinking. These remnants shaped regional long after central authority weakened. In the territories once dominated by the Golden Horde, Mongol influence became deeply embedded in the political evolution of the Rus principalities. Tribute systems established under Mongol rule redefined relationships between rulers and subjects. Princes who cooperated with Mongol authorities gained legitimacy, and, while those who resisted faced consequences that echoed earlier patterns of enforcement. Over time, this dynamic contributed to the rise of centralized authority in places such as Moscow. The legacy of Mongol control in these regions was not limited to politics. Military organization adapted in response to earlier encounters. The emphasis on and coordinated movement influenced the of regional armies. Even as Mongol dominance receded, the strategies they introduced continued to inform defensive and offensive planning. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate experienced internal transformations that reflected broader patterns of fragmentation. Local elites asserted greater control, and the balance between nomadic and settled populations shifted over time. Trade routes remained active, but their management became more localized, reducing the of integration that had characterized earlier Mongol rule. The Ilkhanate in Persia underwent significant following its establishment. The adoption of Islam by its rulers facilitated deeper integration with the surrounding population, aligning governance with existing cultural and religious frameworks. This transition strengthened internal stability for a time, but it also marked a departure from the shared identity that had once connected the Mongol. In East Asia, the Yuan dynasty, under successors of Kublai Khan, faced increasing internal challenges. Economic strain, difficulties, and social tensions contributed to weakening control. The eventual of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 led to the rise of the Ming dynasty, signaling the end of direct Mongol rule in China. However, Mongol groups remained present in the Pei, continuing to influence regional dynamics. What connects these diverse developments is that of Mongol in shaping governance and warfare. Systems of taxation, communication, and organization introduced during the empire's expansion did not with its fragmentation. They were adapted by successor states, becoming part of the evolving political landscape. The psychological dimension of Mongol conquest also persisted. The memory of cities destroyed for resistance remained embedded in historical consciousness. Chronicles, oral traditions, and administrative records preserved accounts of annihilation and submission. These narratives influenced how later rulers approached conflict, often favoring negotiation or strategic withdrawal over direct confrontation when faced with overwhelming force. Trade networks established under Mongol protection continued to function, though with varying degrees of efficiency. The relative safety of long distance during the height of Mongol had encouraged movement of goods and ideas across continents. Even after fragmentation, these connections did not disappear entirely. They evolved, shaped by new political realities, but still reflecting the pathways first stabilized under Mongol authority. Cultural exchange accelerated during and after Mongol expansion. Technologies, knowledge, and artistic influences moved between and with greater frequency. This was not always direct or evenly distributed, but contributed to gradual transformations in multiple regions. The Mongol Empire, despite its, played a role in facilitating these interactions. Military continued to evolve in response to Mongol strategies. Opponents studied their tactics, particularly the use of feigned retreat, rapid maneuver, and coordinated assault. Over time, these methods were incorporated into the doctrines of various states, reducing the element of unpredictability that had once given the Mongols a decisive advantage. At the same time, defensive strategies adapted. Fortifications were reinforced, communication between improved, and alliances were pursued more actively. The experience of facing Mongol campaigns revealed the weaknesses of fragmented resistance, encouraging greater coordination among states that might otherwise have remained divided. Despite these adaptations, the impact of Mongol expansion remained uneven. Some regions recovered relatively quickly, rebuilding urban centers and systems. Others experienced prolonged decline, particularly where populations had been significantly reduced. The of earlier destruction influenced patterns of settlement, production, and governance for generations. Environmental and economic factors also shaped the post-Mongol world. Changes in climate, resource availability, and trade patterns interacted with the political transformations initiated by Mongol conquest. These combined influences contributed to a that extended beyond the lifespan of the empire itself. The Mongols, as a unified imperial force, no longer dominated Eurasia. Yet they continued to shape how power was organized and exercised. The systems they developed, that they secured, and the strategies they employed became part of a broader historical process. What had begun as a campaign of expansion across the steppe had evolved into a transformation of interconnected regions. The Mongol Empire did not leave behind a single successor. It left behind multiple paths, each influenced by its presence. And within those paths, one element remained constant: the understanding that resistance, when met by a capable of total war, could carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. That understanding, shaped by Mongol campaigns, continued to influence decisions long after their armies had passed. Memory does not fade evenly across regions. In some places, it becomes legend. In others, it remains a warning. The Mongol legacy persisted not only in structures, but in the calculations of those who came after. By the late 14th century, the direct political authority of the Mongol Empire had largely dissolved, yet its influence remained embedded in the systems that governed Eurasia. Former territories did not simply revert to pre-Mongol conditions. Instead, they evolved within frameworks that had been reshaped by decades of conquest. And in Eastern Europe, the long of Mongol dominance under the Golden Horde left lasting institutional effects. Tribute systems, census practices, and methods of centralized control influenced the of emerging states that had once submitted to Mongol authority began consolidating power, often using administrative techniques adapted from their overlords. This gradual centralization contributed to the rise of stronger political entities capable of exerting control over broader territories. The relationship between rulers and subjects had also shifted. The expectation of structured taxation and became more normalized, replacing earlier patterns of fragmented authority. While this did not eliminate conflict, it introduced a level of predictability that facilitated governance. The legacy of Mongol oversight thus extended beyond direct control into the internal organization of successor states. In Central Asia, the fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate led to the emergence of competing powers, each drawing on elements of Mongol tradition. Among these figures was Timur, whose campaigns in the late 14th century reflected both continuity and transformation. Although not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan in the primary line, Timur invoked Mongol legacy to legitimize his authority. Timur's strategies echoed earlier Mongol methods, including rapid movement of forces and the use of psychological intimidation. Cities that resisted were subjected to severe consequences, reinforcing a pattern that had been established generations earlier. Yet his campaigns also reflected the changing political landscape, incorporating elements of Persian and Islamic governance. The recurrence of such methods demonstrates that Mongol influence extended beyond their own political existence. It became a reference point for subsequent conquerors seeking to establish authority across diverse regions. The idea that overwhelming force, combined with calculated terror, could produce rapid submission remained a powerful strategic concept. In the Middle East, the Ilkhanate created a fragmented environment in which multiple competed for control. The administrative systems introduced under Mongol rule did not. They were adapted by successor states. Taxation frameworks, land management practices, and communication networks continued to shape governance even as political shifted. Trade routes, though affected by regional instability, retained elements of the connectivity established during the height of Mongol influence. Merchants continued to traverse long distances, though with greater risk and variation in security. That had once been unified under a single authority now passed through multiple jurisdictions, each imposing its own regulations. In East Asia, the Yuan dynasty marked of indigenous rule under the Ming. However, the experience of Mongol governance left a lasting imprint. Administrative practices, military organization, and frontier management strategies were influenced by to respond to pay-based threats. The Ming state invested heavily in fortifications and communication systems designed to prevent incursions similar to those that had enabled Mongol conquest. The psychological dimension of Mongol expansion remained particularly significant. The memory of entire cities destroyed for resistance became part of the historical consciousness of multiple civilizations. This memory influenced diplomatic and military decisions, encouraging caution when confronting highly mobile and coordinated forces. Chronicles from different regions preserved accounts of Mongol campaigns, often emphasizing the scale of destruction. While such accounts sometimes contain exaggerations, their cumulative effect reinforced a perception of Mongol power that extended beyond empirical. The reputation itself became in shaping behavior. Military doctrines across Eurasia continued to evolve in response to Mongol. The importance of intelligence gathering, rapid communication, and coordinated maneuver became more widely recognized. Armies adapted by improving reconnaissance capabilities and developing more flexible command structures. At the same time, defensive strategies were refined. Fortifications were redesigned to withstand prolonged siege, supply systems were strengthened, and alliances were pursued to counter the isolated. The lessons learned from Mongol invasions contributed to a transformation in how wars were conducted. Economic consequences also persisted. Regions that had been heavily affected by Mongol destruction experienced long-term demographic and agricultural changes. Population recovery varied, influencing patterns of settlement and production. In some areas, previously dominant urban centers never fully regained their earlier prominence. Yet alongside disruptions, the Mongol period facilitated significant cultural and intellectual exchange. Knowledge moved across regions through trade and migration. Scientific ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations in ways that might not have been possible without the earlier unification of vast territories. This dual legacy, destruction and connection, defines the broader impact of Mongol expansion. It complicates simple interpretations of their role in history. While their campaigns brought severe suffering to many regions, they also contributed to processes that reshaped global interaction. As successor states navigated this, they did so within a framework that had been permanently altered. Political boundaries, economic networks, and cultural exchanges all reflected the influence of Mongol rule, even in its absence. By the 15th century, the direct of Mongol governance had become intertwined with new developments. Emerging powers built upon, modified, or reacted against the systems left behind. The Mongols were no longer present as a dominant imperial force, but their imprint remained visible in the power that followed. And within those structures, a particular understanding endured. That control over vast territories required more than conquest. It required systems capable of managing distance, diversity, and resistance. The Mongols had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of such control. And in doing so, they reshaped not only the lands they conquered, but the very logic of empire itself. Empires do not end when their borders dissolve. They continue in the systems they leave behind, and the fears they imprint on those who remember. The Mongols did both, and endured long after their unity disappeared. By the 15th century, the political map of Eurasia had transformed into a network shaped directly or indirectly by Mongol expansion. The original imperial structure no longer existed as a single entity, yet its influence remained embedded in governance, warfare, and long-distance interaction. What had once been enforced through conquest now persisted through adaptation. In Eastern Europe, the decline of the Golden Horde created space for powers to emerge. Among them, the Principality of Moscow expanded its authority, drawing on administrative practices that had developed under Mongol oversight. Tribute systems evolved into centralized taxation, and the experience of dealing with a dominant force influenced the consolidation of internal power. The memory of Mongol dominance shaped how rulers approached both governance and defense. This transformation was not immediate. It unfolded over decades, marked by shifting alliances and resistance. Yet the legacy of Mongol rule provided a framework within which these changes occurred. Even as Mongol authority receded, the structures it had introduced continued to guide political organization. In Central Asia, the of Mongol control remained visible in the of trade routes and traditions. Successor states and regional leaders maintained elements of steppe warfare, emphasizing mobility and coordinated maneuver. These practices did not disappear with the fragmentation of the empire. They were absorbed into the evolving strategies of local. The influence of figures such as Timur further illustrates this continuity. His campaigns, though distinct in and context, reflected the enduring appeal of methods first refined during Mongol expansion. Rapid movement of forces and the strategic use of intimidation remained effective tools for asserting control. In the Middle East, the political landscape that followed the collapse of the Ilkhanate was marked by fragmentation and yet administrative systems introduced under Mongol rule persisted. Taxation structures, land management practices, and bureaucratic continued to influence governance. These systems were modified to suit local conditions, but their principles remained recognizable. Trade, though affected by regional instability, continued to link distant regions. The routes that had been secured during the height of Mongol authority did not disappear. Instead, they became contested spaces where multiple powers sought to exert control. Merchants adapted to changing conditions, navigating a more complex but still interconnected world. In East Asia, the end of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming under Mongol Emperor marked a deliberate effort to reassert indigenous control. However, the experience of Mongol influenced the policies of the new regime. Military organization, frontier defense, and administrative oversight all reflected lessons learned from a highly adversary. The construction and reinforcement of defensive structures, including sections of the Great Wall, were part of a broader strategy to prevent incursions to those that had enabled Mongol conquest. Communication systems were strengthened, and greater emphasis was placed on coordinated response to external threats. The psychological legacy of Mongol expansion remained a significant factor in this period. Historical records across regions continued to reference the consequences of resistance encountered during earlier campaigns. These accounts shaped collective memory, influencing how societies perceived external and internal stability. Military doctrine across Eurasia incorporated lessons derived from Mongol tactics. The importance of and coordination became more widely acknowledged. Armies adapted by improving communication, training, and organizational flexibility. While no single state replicated the Mongol system entirely, many integrated aspects of it into their own frameworks. At the same time, defensive approaches evolved. States recognized the risks of a highly mobile enemy without adequate preparation. Fortifications were redesigned, supply chains, and alliances pursued to counter potential invasions. The experience of Mongol campaigns highlighted the dangers of fragmentation, encouraging greater coordination among neighboring powers. Economic patterns also reflected the enduring influence of Mongol rule. Regions that had been integrated into long-distance trade networks continued to benefit from connectivity, even as political control shifted. The exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies persisted, contributing to gradual in multiple societies. However, the of earlier destruction were still visible in certain areas. Urban centers that had been devastated during Mongol campaigns did not always recover fully. Population declines, shifts in settlement patterns, and disruptions to agricultural production had long-term consequences. These effects influenced regional development for generations. Cultural exchange, facilitated in part by the earlier unification of territories under Mongol control, continued to shape intellectual and artistic trends. Knowledge moved across regions through trade and diplomacy, contributing to a broader of. While this exchange was not uniform, it reflected the connection established during the Mongol period. By the end of the 15th century, the Mongols were no longer a dominant imperial force, but their legacy remained embedded in the structures of power across Eurasia. The systems they had introduced, the routes they had secured, and the strategies they had employed continued to influence how states operated and interacted. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had evolved into a lasting transformation of political and economic relationships. The Mongol Empire, though fragmented, had reshaped the context in which future empires would rise. And within that context, one principle endured: that the effectiveness of power did not depend solely on its ability to conquer, but on its capacity to alter the behavior of others, even in its absence. The Mongols had demonstrated this with lasting clarity. Their armies were no longer present in many of the lands they had once dominated. Yet the decisions of rulers, of states, and the expectations of populations continued to reflect the shadow of their methods. a shadow defined not only by expansion, but by the calculated use of destruction to enforce a new order. Empires are remembered not for how they begin, but for what they leave behind. The Mongols did not leave monuments in every land they crossed. They left consequences, measurable, structural, and enduring. By the time the Mongol Empire had fully fragmented, its direct political authority had receded into regional powers that no longer operated as a unified system. Yet the deeper transformation it imposed across Eurasia continued to define how states functioned, how wars were fought, and how rulers calculated risk. The Mongols had altered the relationship between and compliance in a way that outlasted theirs. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy was the normalization of large-scale coordinated warfare across vast distances. Before Mongol expansion, many states operated within geographical frameworks, constrained by communication delays and logistical challenges. The Mongols demonstrated that these limitations could be overcome through disciplined organization, reliable communication systems, and strategic planning. Their use of relay networks, structured command hierarchies, and intelligence gathering created that later powers would attempt, in varying degrees, to replicate. The psychological dimension of their campaigns proved equally influential. The deliberate use of destruction as a strategic tool reshaped how resistance was perceived. It was no longer simply a matter of defending territory. It became a calculation of survival. Communities faced a choice between submission and the risk of annihilation, a framework that introduced a level of pressure into decision-making processes. This approach did not originate with the Mongols, but they refined it with a consistency that made it central to their success. Over time, this recalibration of risk influenced diplomatic behavior. States became more cautious in confronting overwhelming forces, often seeking negotiation or temporary accommodation rather than immediate conflict. The expectation that resistance could trigger disproportionate consequences altered the balance between aggression and restraint. Even in regions where Mongol authority had long disappeared, this awareness remained embedded in political. Administratively, the Mongols contributed to the systems capable of managing diverse populations across extensive territories. Their willingness to incorporate existing bureaucratic structures allowed them to govern regions with established traditions without dismantling local practices. This pragmatic approach demonstrated that effective control did not require uniformity. It required adaptability within a framework of overarching authority. Taxation systems introduced or refined under Mongol rule emphasized accountability and assessment. Populations were recorded, resources quantified, and obligations defined. While often burdensome, these systems created a degree of predictability that could stabilize governance. Successor states adopted and modified these practices, integrating them into their own administrative models. Trade networks, significantly expanded during the height of Mongol influence, continued to shape economic relationships long after the empire's unity dissolved. The provided across large of Eurasia facilitated movement of goods, people, and ideas on a scale that had previously been difficult to sustain. Even as political fragmentation introduced new challenges, the wave of connection established during this period remained active, contributing to ongoing exchange between regions. Cultural and intellectual interaction also reflected this legacy. Knowledge moved along the same routes as trade, carrying scientific ideas, medical practices, and artistic influences between East and West. This exchange was not always or evenly distributed, but contributed to gradual transformations in multiple societies. The Mongol period thus functioned as a conduit through which different parts of the world became more interconnected. Military thought across Eurasia absorbed lessons from Mongol campaigns. The of mobility and coordinated became more widely recognized. Armies adapted by improving communication, training, and organizational flexibility. While no later power replicated the Mongol system in its entirety, many incorporated elements of it into their own doctrines. Defensive strategies evolved in parallel. The experience of Mongol invasions revealed the vulnerabilities of fragmented resistance and static defense. States responded by fortifications, developing more responsive command structures, and pursuing alliances to counter potential threats. The recognition that speed and coordination could overcome traditional defenses led to a re-evaluation of how wars were prepared and fought. Yet the Mongol legacy was not solely one of innovation and connectivity. The destruction that accompanied their expansion had lasting consequences for many regions. Urban centers that were devastated during campaigns often required generations to recover, if they recovered at all. Population losses, disruption of agricultural systems, and the collapse of local economies created long-term challenges that shaped regional development. In some areas, these disruptions contributed to shifts in power. Regions that had been weakened became susceptible to new forms of control, while others adapted more successfully, rebuilding and consolidating authority. The uneven nature of recovery reflects the complexity of Mongol impact, which varied significantly across different. The fragmentation of the empire itself offers insight into the limitations of Mongol governance. While their systems were effective in facilitating rapid expansion, maintaining unified control over such vast territories proved difficult. Regional adaptation, a strength during conquest, became a source of divergence during. Each khanate developed according to its own conditions, gradually evolving into distinct political entities. Despite this fragmentation, the shared heritage of Mongol rule continued to influence interactions between these successor states. Diplomatic relations, trade, and occasional conflict were shaped by a common understanding of power that had emerged during the empire's height. Even as unity faded, the underlying framework remained recognizable. The figure of Genghis Khan himself became part of this enduring legacy. His methods, decisions, and that he established were studied, interpreted, and, in some cases, emulated by later leaders. He was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as the architect of a system that redefined across continents. Successors and later rulers, including figures such as Timur, drew upon this legacy to legitimize their own campaigns. The invocation of Mongol authority became a means of connecting new ambitions to an established model of success. This continuity demonstrates how the influence of the Mongols extended beyond their immediate historical context. By the early modern period, the direct of Mongol rule had become integrated into the broader fabric of Eurasian history. States that had never been conquered by the Mongols still operated within a world shaped by their expansion. Trade routes and military expectations all reflected the introduced during the 13th and 14th centuries. What distinguishes the Mongol Empire in historical analysis is not the scale of its reach, but in which it combined destruction with integration. The same campaigns that erased cities also created conditions for unprecedented connectivity. This duality complicates simple interpretations, requiring an understanding that encompasses both devastation and transformation. The cities that were destroyed did not vanish entirely from history. Their absence became part of the record, influencing how later generations understood the consequences of power. Archaeological evidence, written accounts, and oral traditions preserve the memory of what had occurred, ensuring that the impact of Mongol campaigns remained visible even where physical had faded. At the same time, the systems that replaced or rebuilt those cities reflected lessons learned from there. Urban planning, defensive architecture, and administrative organization evolved in response to earlier vulnerabilities. In this way, destruction contributed indirectly to subsequent development, shaping how societies attempted to prevent similar outcomes. The broader geopolitical impact of Mongol expansion extended beyond Eurasia. The trade routes facilitated indirect connections with regions further west, contributing to shifts in global awareness and interaction. While these effects were gradual, they form part of a longer trajectory of increasing interconnection between distant parts of the world. As a historical phenomenon, the Mongol Empire resists simple categorization. It was neither solely a force of destruction nor purely one of integration. It was a system that applied both with calculated intent, producing outcomes that varied across time and place. In examining how Mongol armies turned resistance into erased cities and mass killing, it becomes clear that these actions were not isolated or impulsive. They were of a broader strategy designed to enforce compliance, accelerate conquest, and establish control. The effectiveness of this strategy lay not only in its immediate results, but in its ability to influence behavior far beyond the battlefield. The ultimate legacy of the Mongols is therefore found in their impact. Their empire fragmented, their armies dispersed, but the structures they created and the lessons they imposed remained embedded in the development of subsequent states. Power, as demonstrated by the Mongols, was not only about the ability to destroy. It was about the ability to ensure that the possibility of destruction shaped every decision made in its presence. And long after their banners disappeared from the horizon, that possibility continued to define the world they had changed.